The Indigo disc finally brings closure to this long journey through Paldea, its last moments, lessons, and Pokemon. There are 8 new faces to meet, but will they be able to provide a clear picture of all the issues that remain unsolved on their own? Can they crack the mystery of the 9th gen? Today I'll be explaining all the new Pokemon from the Indigo disc, as I did with the rest of Paradox forms, Mega Evolutions, and recently Gigantamax. We'll not only discuss their concepts and inspirations, but also try to understand what they bring to the infinite puzzle of this generation and the Pokemon world. In the teal mask, we already found an unexpected new side of a Pokemon that we were very familiar with. Diplin, an applin that made its home in a fruit of the apple orchards in the region and was unexpectedly covered in candy during the famous Mask Festival. However, even before the release of this new DLC, it was hiding a terrible secret. When it was holding an Eviolite, it seemed to receive less damage than normal. That was an oversight that pointed too early to this Pokemon's new evolution. Or maybe it was not as accidental as we thought. Hydrapple is the overgrowth and proliferation of the dragons inside the fruit, taking the aspect of a terrible hydra. It was said that when one of its heads was cut off, even more would sprout, explaining the overpopulation of specimens inside the apple. But sometimes, to fully understand a Pokemon, we must turn our gaze towards its trainer, watching how during the events of the game Kieran is enticed by his inner demons, showing his most ambitious and ruthless side. His ace, Hydrapple, could also be a reference to the Garden of Eden and the original sin, being the Pokemon at the same time both the forbidden apple and the serpent. The idea of a worm-infested apple is also quite symbolic of this perfidious story. The whole thing reaches a new level of madness when you consider that this bond has been developing ever since Kieran caught his beloved Pokemon in the Apple Hills of Kitakami to become this terrible beast. A growth parallel to that of an innocent town boy who would be dragged by the darkness of his heart until he became the trainer we find in these DLCs, both left looking for their own paradise. If you still feel like this Pokemon's biblical reference is a bit of a stretch, you should know that the supposed Hydra is actually formed by 7 serpents inside the apple, which is paradoxically a sacred number that represents perfection and wholeness, like the one this line can only reach in this remote situation. Archaludon, as we already reviewed in its first announcement, is a powerful dragon Pokemon that goes from a pre-evolution based on the tallest building in the United Kingdom to an imposing bridge. Now that we know that Blueberry Academy is in the Unova region and that its master trainer Drayton is Drayden's grandson, we can get a much better picture of why this transformation is so surprising. Having grown up with Iris, the prodigy, he would yearn to be stronger, so he could have approached his grandfather, asking for guidance on how to become stronger with his beloved Archaludon. This great dragon-type master would then show him the bridges of Unova, which he's of course very familiar with as the mayor of Opelucid City. At first, Drayton would not understand what he meant by that. Still, eventually, he would come to recognize in its mechanisms an incredible power that he could apply to his beloved Pokemon, which reinforced with a special alloy metal, like the one used in the bridges, would reach this terrifying form of power equivalent to a pseudo-legendary. This would technically make it a Pokemon from Unova, but it's still part of the Paldea Pokédex. In the previous video, I suggested that the Bridge Pavilion might have inspired it. But to be honest, it didn't sound that good, and I've been wondering since then if there was any legend that would fit better with this story as to wait until Paldea to introduce such a special Pokemon. To my own surprise, I discovered the Dragon Bridge in Alcalá de Guadaira. I can't really describe how exciting it is to make this kind of discovery when these Pokemon have just been released and there is almost no information about them. With these 2 epic but rather earthy Pokemon out of the way, it's time to go back to Area 0 to meet once again with the Paradox Pokemon. As usual, the future forms are aesthetically just robotic recreations of the Pokemon that inspired them. So the most interesting thing we can do with those is to ponder what intentions someone in that distant future could have in reimagining these supposedly long-gone Pokemon. In Iron Boulder's case, it was modeled after one of the Swords of Justice, born to protect Pokemon from human abuse, and it's especially interesting how a dubious magazine theorizes that it could be a Terrakion modified by an evil organization. Of course, the first one you would think of is Team Plasma, which already have a record of robotic modifications with Genesect, and shared a similar goal to the Swords of Justice in public, to protect Pokemon. All these rumors may have reached the ears of the magazine's editors for a rushed article with this theory. Sounds possible, right? Let's not forget what we saw in my video about the Paradox Pokemon. The magazine always comes up with some hypothetical scenarios full of easy-to-detect contradictions, and in this case, it's very unlikely that Team Plasma, disbanded years ago, would reappear in a supposedly distant future. However, it's not entirely impossible to imagine a future in which Pokemon are badly seen and treated, with a group rebelling against the status quo, founding an organization inspired by the King of the Past, who, according to legends, stood up for the equality of people and Pokemon. Unfortunately, the magazine's comments about its fellow Iron Crown are not as inspiring and interesting. It just says that it resembles a cutting-edge weapon shaped like a Cobalion. It would still fit the previous hypothesis. And just as an invincible army of Genesects was Team Plasma's plan B in our present, one commanded by these ruthless versions of the Swords of Justice could be what this weird hypothetical future had in store. On the opposite extreme, we have Raging Bolt, which we'll quickly skip over because it's a design with lots and lots of details that we already analyzed in depth when the Pokemon was officially announced. It's based on the Brontosaurus, which comes from ancient Greek and translates literally as Thunder Lizard. So, many fanart predictions came dangerously close to its final design. It's definitely one of those designs that play with people's expectations, stretching its neck dramatically as a joke about how lightning bolts try to take the shortest path to reach the ground, and even has arrows all along that suggest an imminent danger. Despite the rage that its name, design, and the magazine are warning about, it's a really tame and calm Pokemon, fueling that paradoxical nature. But the real surprise that no one saw coming from these DLCs is Gouging Fire, based like the paradox forms of the other two legendary beasts on a dinosaur, the Styracosaurus. Like this one, it has a huge headpiece on its face, surely the most eye-catching feature of its design. Due to its appearance and the fact that Entei has the kanji for emperor in its name, I immediately thought of the Incas. But if you look at the colors and the shape, it looks very reminiscent of Ho-Oh. If you look closely, you can even see a heart shape, like the heart of gold that this legendary Pokemon symbolized in the remakes. That's the key to the contradictory and paradoxical side of this creature. It seems to be a reference to Ho-Oh, but this is not the Entei that was created from a Pokemon resurrected by the sacred bird's powers, but a completely different being from another universe. But then, what is it doing honoring the Ho-Oh of our world like that? Despite the contradictory nature of the Paradox Pokemon that we have already identified, if we finally decide to believe that these Pokemon are time travelers, does this mean that timelines are infinite, and therefore there are as many universes as imaginable possibilities? Even universes that before our eyes make no sense at all. So, what is actually going on with Paradox Pokemon? If we consider the appearance of the professors in clutch time to assert in their own voice that they arrived from another timeline, and as if that were not enough, they give us the original manuscript of the Violet or Scarlet book. And we can also see at the bottom of Area 0 some notes that refer to this event and determine the temporal paradox. Does this confirm that Paradox Pokemon are time travelers and have not been created based on dreams and illusions? Well, to know my take on it, you will have to wait a little while, as the topic is a lot more complex than it seems. In exchange, I promise that in the next few days, I will upload the best possible video with my final verdict on what is going on in this generation's story and the true nature of these Pokemon. But for now, let's close the video with the two real protagonists of the DLCs. Let's start with the one that makes things easier for us, Terapagos. If this is the easy one, imagine how hard it will be the other. Apart from the obvious origins, the Galapagos tortoise, and the one on the tail of Urashimataro, which also fits perfectly with everything we find down there, by the way, it would be primarily inspired by how, in many ancient cultures, a tortoise allows the world to exist as a world. The most famous is a Hindu myth where this animal directly carries the world on its shell. But surprisingly, many other cultures give this animal similar divine properties. For example, in China there is a millenary myth where the sky doesn't fall on the earth thanks to a turtle. It's no coincidence that such a symbolic animal was chosen for this Pokemon, as the divine attributes of Terapagos transcend anything we've seen so far in the series. Its aura glows with the power of all elemental types, because following the idea of the world turtle, its energy is, in a way, the energy of the whole Pokemon Pokemon world in its variety, wholeness, and dreams, because we simply cannot ignore how this Pokemon turns into a dream catcher at the decisive moment. Add to this the fact that its crystals make possible the impossible, even in the last corner of the region, and also during the event that supposedly comes to refute the dream theory, it's precisely at its side, with everything surrounded by a Waneric mist, that everything is over and a pond suddenly appearing in our room. Nobody speaks about what happened. I promise you that I'm not trying to stick rigidly to my theory, and I'll have no problem admitting I was wrong if I can see the answer clearly, but everything is so contradictory and paradoxical. But that's enough. I'm already saying more than I should. Stay tuned for the video over the next few days, for which I'll try to sum up my thoughts in the best possible way, to share with you my most precise vision of everything that these DLCs and the generation as a whole has brought to the table. If you're still hungry for more, you can take a look at other videos analyzing extensively some Pokemon, such as the last one about Gigantamax forms that will surely surprise you. See you soon.